Prefigurative Politics in Social Movements. My name is Andy Cornell. I'll be chairing the discussion today. So what I wanted to do is first introduce our esteemed panelists, and then I'll make a few kind of contextualizing remarks, and then we'll move into the talks proper, the presentations. So first of all, we'll be hearing from Chris Dixon. And Chris is a longtime anti-authoritarian activist, writer, and educator. He's a PhD candidate in the History of Consciousness program at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He also serves on the advisory board of the activist journal Upping the Ante. Right now he lives in Sudbury, Ontario, where he organizes with Sudbury against war and occupation. Secondly, we'll have Cindy Milstein speaking. Cindy's a board member of the Institute for Anarchist Studies, co-organizer of the annual Renewing the Anarchist Tradition Conference, and she's also a collective member of Black Sheep Books in Montpelier, Vermont. She writes essays and does community organizing. And Black Sheep has a table downstairs that people should stop by and see what they have. After Cindy speaks, we're going to hear from Harjit Singh Gill. He's a South Asian American activist and a member of the Institute for Anarchist Studies, as well as a member of the Anarchist People of Color Network. Finally, we're going to hear from Debbie Gould. Her interests are in political emotion and contentious politics. She's just finished a book on the AIDS movement. It's called Moving Politics, Emotion and ACT UP's Fight Against AIDS. And she teaches at the University of Pittsburth, right? Great. So today's conversation is about the idea of prefigurative politics. And I think this is a term that's come into more widespread use and circulation in the last 10 or 15 years or so. But sometimes people forget that it actually has a long and distinguished history, and we can think about how the concept has grown and changed historically. To some extent, we might even look back to utopian socialism and their attempts to build colonies that can prefigure the kinds of economic relations they hope to see, in which they hoped they would provide an inspiring example, and that would be enough to make social change. People would naturally come over to this more utopian way of living. More recently, we can think of the I.W.W. Early in the 20th century, right? And people have spoken about this idea of prefigurative politics in a number of different ways, or phrased it. The I.W.W. famously said that they were building the new world in the shell of the old as they did their organizing. We might also think of Gandhi and his phrase, "Be the change you want to see." In some ways, that conveys the same kind of concepts. More recently, there's a movement for a new society, which was active in the anti-nuclear movement and other movements in the 70s and 80s. And they thought of a kind of important part of their program and strategy was to live the revolution now. That's how they kind of pointed it out. And I think that prefigurative politics, while it's broad, it has had a long tradition in the anarchist and anti-authoritarian movements. I'm something of a historian myself, and I thought I'd just bring one kind of historical moment to bear to kind of set the context of what we're talking about. So one thing I found in the archives, actually in the Labadie collection, a real rich source of political material at the University of Michigan, was this pamphlet from 1951. It's called The World Seen from the Libertarian Point of View. And it was put out by a group, the Free Society Group of Chicago, right at the onset of the Cold War. So this is a kind of probably the low point of anarchism in U.S. history. And kind of a debate was going on then of what the hell do we do, where we have the rising kind of welfare state in the U.S., we have this catastrophe of a revolution in the Soviet Union, the kind of increase of Soviet imperialism. And so there's a discussion in this pamphlet. And a first position is laid out by the famous Russian-American anarchist G.P. Maximov, Gregory Maximov. And he's writing just before his death, and I think he kind of sounds this really sad note. He says, and he's talking specifically about this conflict of the issue of the Cold War and what do we do as anarchists. He says, "Since we cannot destroy both warring factions simultaneously, we have only this alternative: to sit by passively, which is an attitude neither camp will permit, or to side with those whose victory will give us our best chance to unite the proletariat and overthrow the victors. That side, strange as it may seem, is the capitalist bourgeoisie, not the communist dictatorship, represented by a new class of bureaucrats. Such is the paradox of history. So Maximoff is trying to think in this kind of far from ideal situation of strategy and what do we do. And he ends up kind of leaning towards one pole in the Cold War dynamics. Later on, in the same pamphlet, a younger anarchist, kind of coming from a different perspective, the perspective of anarcho-pacifism, a World War II draft resistor, David Thoreau-Wiek, takes kind of a different position. And I think this is an amazingly powerful, kind of a really powerful way of laying out the prefigurative position in 1951. He says, forget about choosing sides, picking kind of the least dangerous enemy to side with, etc. And he says, we have learned that as groups living the ethics and meaning of anarchism, we create an anarchist community in and as our movement, and demonstrate by this new society our ideas and their practicality. By daily acts of life, we are more deeply angered, gifted with hatred at a kind of life as it is, more deeply knowing in our hearts that we must live differently, more earnestly searching in each direction our strength allows us, ways and instruments and friends and comrades in a struggle which must have this form, the creation of new life or continuing death. So I think David Thoreau-Wiek is laying out the position in pretty strong terms. I'm really interested to hear from all of our panelists today. I think they want to speak both to the benefits and maybe to some drawbacks or possible contradictions within this idea of prefiguration as a mode of social change or a way of doing it.